The sound came first, a sharp crack that split the air like winter ice snapping under weight, and in that instant, I knew something inside me had given way, my ribs screaming before my voice could catch up. My brother Daniel's shoulder had driven me into the edge of the coffee table, the corner cutting into my side with surgical cruelty, and the breath left me in a rush of hot copper taste. I fell sideways to the floor, hands clutching for anything to steady myself, but before I could gather even half a breath, another blow came harder lower. My father Richard's boot connected with my ribs again, lifting me off the floor for the briefest second, and when I landed, the living room swam in white heat. My vision blurred, but through the haze I saw my mother, Margaret, standing by the doorway holding her porcelain teacup, not horrified, not shocked, but smiling. Her lips curled in satisfaction as if watching a play unfold exactly as scripted. My head pounded with the realization this was not an accident. This was an execution of control. Daniel loomed over me, his cologne suffocating his voice low and deliberate. "You will sign Clara. You will not take what does not belong to you." His words dripped like oil, heavy and final. My ribs ached with every shallow inhale, but I tasted blood and something else rage that cut through the fog. Richard, towering behind him, said nothing at first, just adjusted his belt as if to ready another strike. Then he muttered, almost bored, "Stop pretending you matter, you're only making it worse." And Margaret, still sipping tea, tilted her head and said softly, "You should have learned long ago not to defy this family." The betrayal pressed down heavier than the pain. The three people meant to protect me had turned into my executioners. I thought of my grandfather's voice the way he had once said, "This land will be yours too." Clara, and that memory burned against the sight of Daniel clutching documents on the coffee table, my name nowhere on them. Pain clawed at my chest, but another sound cut through the faint buzz of my phone in my coat pocket. In the chaos, I remembered I had left the recorder running earlier, tucked away, half forgotten, now alive. Red light blinking like a secret heartbeat. Daniel leaned closer, his shadow swallowing me, whispering, "If you tell anyone, I will erase you, not just from this house, but from every trace of this family. No roof, no name, no scent of you left behind." He thought he was sealing my silence, but my fingers twitched against the fabric of my coat, closing over the phone. I felt its weight not as a burden, but as a weapon. The living room clock ticked loud each second, stretching my body, screaming with every movement, yet a single vow carved itself into me. I would not be erased. Not this time. The smell of lemon polish, spilled tea, and my own blood fused into a scene I knew would not vanish. Not for me. Not for them. Margaret's smile widened. Daniel's voice pressed harder. Richard shifted his stance for another kick. But inside, past the broken ribs and burning lungs, a different crack echoed the crack of fear, shattering into defiance. I dragged air into my chest, every inch of it agony, but it was mine, and with that breath came the first thought of survival. Not just survival, but revenge. Hours earlier, the house had smelled of rosemary and garlic, the kind of meal my mother only bothered with when she wanted something to look perfect. The dining table gleamed under the overhead light. Silverware polished china plates set with precision crystal glasses reflecting the flicker of the fireplace. I walked in with unease crawling under my skin, but I forced a calm smile, reminding myself that Sunday dinners had once been a place of warmth before they turned into staged performances of control. Daniel sat at the head of the table, our father's old seat, a glass of red wine in hand, his other arm draped casually over the chair back as though the throne already belonged to him. My mother moved about with choreographed steps, setting down the roast beef, her eyes careful not to meet mine. My father, Richard, leaned back in his chair, thick hands folded over his stomach, the presence of a man who considered himself the judge before the trial even began. I felt like I was stepping into a courtroom and I was already guilty. Dinner began with shallow small talk, the clink of cutlery against porcelain filling the silences that felt deliberate. Then Daniel reached for the leather folder beside him and slid it across the table. It stopped in front of my plate, the edges brushing my fork. These, he said in a tone smooth as polished steel, are the documents to transfer the property into my name for management purposes. I looked down at the papers, the words bold, stark, my name absent from every line. My stomach twisted. I asked, "Where is Grandpa's will?" Daniel leaned back, smirk curling his mouth. "Simplified," he said, "for tax reasons." Father nodded in agreement. Margaret added lightly without looking at me, "It will keep things neat, Clara. One person in charge, no confusion." The air around me grew colder despite the fire's warmth. I remembered Grandpa's voice, his hand on my shoulder when I was a girl, telling me this land would be shared, that fairness mattered more than convenience. That promise was nowhere in these pages. I pushed the folder back. "I'm not signing." Daniel's smirk disappeared, his eyes hardening into flat stone. He leaned forward, his shoulders broad and threatening, his voice dropping to a growl. "We can do this the easy way or the way you won't like." My mother's eyes flicked to him. Not to me, her silence louder than any spoken threat. Richard tapped his knuckles on the table and said, "Be sensible, girl. Your brother knows how to handle these things. You don't." His words stung not just because of their cruelty, but because of the history sewn into them. My whole life I had been told I couldn't, shouldn't, mustn't. And here it was again, the verdict delivered before I had even stood to argue. I forced my voice to stay steady. "I want to see the original will." Daniel's laugh was sharp mocking. "You don't get to make demands. You either cooperate or you find yourself outside this family for good." The room tilted the world, narrowing to the sound of the clock ticking in the hallway. Margaret set her fork down, her eyes cool, as she said, "Maybe it's time you think about what you can and can't handle, dear." The word dear hit me like a slap, the false tenderness sharper than open contempt. Daniel pulled a page from the envelope, a transfer of ownership with my signature line blank and waiting. Above it, his name already signed in bold strokes. The witness line carried my mother's name. My throat tightened, rage warring with disbelief. They had staged this entire dinner as a trap. I pushed the paper back again this time without touching it. "I am not signing anything." The silence that followed was suffocating. Daniel's jaw flexed, his smile thinned to nothing. Father exhaled heavily through his nose, shaking his head as if I were a foolish child. Margaret gathered the plates with quick, controlled movements, lips pressed into a straight line, her silence an admission of complicity. My pulse hammered. I knew then this wasn't just about property. It was about erasing me, stripping me of place and identity, reducing me to nothing more than an unwanted guest in the house where I was born. As Daniel's eyes locked on mine, calm and dangerous, I felt the first ripple of dread that the fight for inheritance was not going to stay on paper. Something darker simmered beneath his control, and my refusal had lit the fuse. The night after that dinner, as I lay awake clutching my aching side, memories rose unbidden like ghosts. They came in fragments, first flashes of childhood moments that seemed ordinary at the time, but now revealed themselves as rehearsals for this exact betrayal. I saw myself at 6 years old, standing on the front porch, crying after Daniel pushed me down the steps. My knees were scraped raw blood running into my socks. I ran to my mother expecting comfort, but she barely looked up from her magazine. "Boys will be boys, Clara," she said with a dismissive wave, and when I tried to protest that I was hurt, she snapped, "Stop exaggerating, you bruise like a peach. You'll be fine." Richard had been in the living room watching a football game, and when I shouted for him, he yelled back, "Toughen up, you sound pathetic." That pattern never changed. Daniel could steal my allowance, break my toys, even slam my bedroom door so hard the frame cracked and my parents would twist it until it was somehow my fault. "You should share more," Margaret would scold. "Don't provoke him," Richard would growl. And the worst of all was when I would cry and they would exchange knowing looks and say, "Clara always was too sensitive." It was gaslighting in its purest form, convincing me that my pain was imaginary, that my reality was distorted, that my very instincts couldn't be trusted. There were school years where Daniel's mediocrity was celebrated like brilliance. He brought home a C in math, and Father clapped him on the back with pride, saying, "At least you passed." I brought home an A- in English, and Margaret pursed her lips, asking, "What happened to the plus?" Every accomplishment of mine was diminished, every failure of his excused. The message was clear: he was the heir, I was the disappointment. The only reprieve I had was with Grandpa Joseph. My grandfather carried the kind of quiet strength that didn't need to announce itself. He spent hours with me in the orchard, showing me how to prune apple trees, teaching me how to oil the barn hinges so they wouldn't rust. He spoke of the land like it was alive, something to be cared for, not owned. One summer, after I had spent weeks repainting the fence in the southern field with him, he handed me a folded map. He traced the property lines with a calloused finger and said, "One day, Clara, this will be yours too. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." His voice had weight, a conviction that settled deep into my bones. It was the only time in my childhood when I felt chosen, valued, seen. But even those moments were shadowed by Daniel's jealousy. He would watch from a distance, glaring as Grandpa showed me how to check the soil or mend a gate latch. Later, he would corner me in the barn, his voice dripping venom. "You think he likes you more? He's old. He doesn't know better. When he's gone, no one will care what he promised you." I learned to swallow those words, but they carved lines into me, grooves of doubt that only deepened as the years passed. By the time I left for college at 20, I believed distance might loosen the chains. I thought maybe if I wasn't under their roof, their voices would stop echoing in my head. But the phone calls came anyway. Margaret would remind me that Daniel was taking business courses while I was off finding myself. Richard would ask if I had met anyone worth marrying yet, as though my value was measured by the man I might attach myself to. Daniel rarely spoke to me directly, but his shadow stretched long. I heard through neighbors that he was handling family affairs, speaking like the property already belonged to him. Every reminder chipped at me, telling me that no matter what I achieved, I was still the outsider. When Grandpa died last year, I thought grief might unite us, if only for a short while. But the reading of the will was postponed again and again, always by Daniel, always with excuses about paperwork and efficiency. In the meantime, he began overseeing the accounts, assuring me that everything was in good hands. A phrase that should have comforted, but instead filled me with dread. Because I knew whose hands he meant, and I knew what they were capable of. The day I heard from a neighbor that a surveyor had been walking the property with Daniel, something inside me twisted. I asked him about it, and he brushed me off, saying I was too young to understand the decisions being made. Too young. The same phrase that had followed me since I was old enough to demand fairness. Too young when I bought my first car. Too young when I moved into my first apartment. Too young when I finished my degree. It was a phrase that wasn't about age at all. It was about control, about silencing me. Looking back, I see now that the gaslighting was never just about individual incidents. It was a lifelong strategy to weaken me, to make me question myself, to ensure that when the time came to seize everything, I would be too broken, too unsure, too silenced to fight back. What they never counted on was that all those years of being told I was too sensitive, too dramatic, too young had built something in me they couldn't see, a resilience forged in rejection, a quiet strength born from always having to stand alone. And that strength, though it trembled under the weight of broken ribs and betrayal, was still there waiting for the moment when I would stop swallowing their lies and start spitting back the truth. The phone call came 2 days later, Margaret's voice on the other end too bright, too sweet, like sugar-coating poison. "Clara," she said, "come by the house, we can talk things through properly. No tension this time, no drama. Just family." My stomach nodded, every instinct telling me it was a lure, but a part of me, the part still craving recognition, still hoping for scraps of fairness, couldn't let it go unanswered. So I said yes, though my voice wavered. The house felt colder than it should when I arrived, the curtains' half-drawn sunlight slanting in thin bars across the hardwood floor. The familiar smell of lemon polish and old wood pressed against me as I stepped into the living room. Daniel was there, waiting folder on the coffee table like a weapon laid out in plain sight. Richard leaned against the mantel arms, crossed his bulk, filling the space with silent intimidation. Margaret stood in the doorway, arms folded, her smile tight rehearsed. It wasn't a negotiation. It was an ambush. "Sit down," Daniel said, gesturing to the sofa, his tone the way a warden might invite a prisoner to their cell. I stayed standing. He slid the folder toward me with 2 fingers. "Sign it. This can all be over." His voice was calm, too calm, the kind that came right before the storm. I shook my head. I want to see the full will, the original, every account, every document. Richard snorted, shaking his head. You don't get to make demands. You were never built for this responsibility. Let your brother take care of things. Margaret chimed in softly. Clara, don't make this harder than it has to be. Think of what's best for everyone. The words dripped with false concern, but her eyes flicked past me to Daniel as if checking whether she had said the right line. Daniel leaned forward, his knuckles pressing into the table, eyes burning. You're going to walk away with nothing but the clothes on your back if you don't cooperate. His voice dipped lower, almost intimate. Dad and Mom know it. I know it. You're outnumbered. The clock ticked in the background, each second hammering the truth of his threat. I tried to stand firm, but then he moved. It happened in a blur, his arm shot out, shoulder slamming into me with brutal force. My body hit the coffee table edge again, the same place already tender, and this time the pain exploded so white-hot I couldn't breathe. I heard the snap deep and sickening, felt the tearing fire in my side. I collapsed to the rug, clutching my ribs, vision tunneling. My own strangled gasp filled the silence. Then another blow, a boot, heavy and deliberate. Richard had stepped forward, his face devoid of emotion, delivering the kick as though he were squashing an insect. The impact knocked what little air I had left from my lungs. I curled in on myself, gasping, eyes watering. Above me, Margaret sipped from her cup, her smile widening as she murmured, You should have listened. Drama always was your flaw. Daniel crouched down close, so close I could feel the heat of his breath, smell the wine on it. If you tell anyone, he whispered, I will erase you. No roof, no money, no name. You'll be less than nothing. My ribs screamed, my chest rattled, but something inside me broke differently, then not bone, but silence. My fingers trembling slid into the pocket of my coat where my phone had landed when I fell. The red recording light still glowed faintly alive, capturing every word. The room shrank around me, their figures looming, their betrayal suffocating. Daniel's shadow swallowed me. Richard loomed with his fists still clenched, Margaret's laugh low and satisfied. The betrayal was complete. The family I had once prayed would protect me had united instead to destroy me. But through the haze of agony, I felt the phone's weight like a lifeline. Every second they spoke, every insult, every threat was not just another wound. It was evidence. It was truth they could not erase. I forced myself up on one elbow, pain roaring tears blinding me, and whispered the only words I could summon, I will not sign. My defiance, weak as it sounded, was a blade cutting the air. Daniel's eyes narrowed. Richard's jaw clenched. Margaret tilted her head like I was a misbehaving child, but for a fraction of a second I saw it a flicker of fear cross Daniel's face. That moment told me everything. He didn't just want control. He feared exposure. He feared what would happen if the truth slipped past these walls. And that fear, tiny as it was, planted itself in me, stronger than the pain, stronger than the years of gaslighting. I might have been broken, bruised, betrayed, but I wasn't beaten. Not yet. The night air cut against my skin as I staggered to the car, every step an exercise in agony, my arm pressed tightly against my ribs to hold myself together. Each inhale felt like knives dragging through my chest, each exhale a shallow gasp. By the time I reached the hospital emergency entrance, sweat clung to my forehead despite the chill. The fluorescent lights inside were too bright, the antiseptic smell stabbing my senses, but it was the triage nurse's sharp eyes that made me falter. She took one look at the way I held myself, the purple bruising already spreading beneath my blouse, and her pen froze mid-air. What happened? She asked. The lie came automatically drilled into me by years of conditioning. I fell down the stairs. The words left my mouth brittle, empty. She didn't argue, but the pause in her scribbling said enough. Moments later, I was wheeled into radiology cold metal under my back, the technician's eyes flicking nervously as I winced when they shifted me for the x-rays. Every movement sent fire ripping through me. When the doctor entered holding the images, his professional mask cracked into something closer to anger. 2 fractured ribs, significant bruising. Possible internal contusions, he recited, but his voice softened as he looked at me. "This isn't from a fall, is it?" I stared at the floor lips pressed tight, unable to answer. He sighed, placed the chart gently on the counter, and said, "I can't force you to talk, but I can document exactly what I see. If you decide to take this further, I'll stand behind it." His words lingered a promise I wasn't ready to claim, but couldn't ignore. When the nurse returned with pain medication and a rib binder, I reached into my coat pocket. The phone was still there, the screen dark, but the app still running. My heart pounded as I stopped the recording and pressed save. The file name appeared cold and ordinary, but it pulsed with power. Their voices, their laughter, their threats captured. Proof that my pain wasn't drama. Proof that my family's cruelty wasn't imagination. Discharged with instructions to rest, I sat in the hospital parking lot gripping the steering wheel, the reality of it pressing harder than the bandages around my chest. My brother had broken my ribs. My father had kicked me while I lay gasping. My mother had smiled, and none of them thought I could do anything about it. For a moment, the weight of that truth threatened to crush me. Then my phone buzzed. Laura, my oldest friend. We hadn't seen each other in weeks, but she had texted, "Are you okay? I don't know why, but I feel like you're not safe." My hands shook as I typed back, "Can I come over?" Within 20 minutes, I was standing at her apartment door, bruised pale, my breath ragged. She opened the door and froze, eyes wide. She didn't ask if it was them. She just said, "Oh my God, Clara. It was him, wasn't it?" I nodded, unable to hold it back any longer. "He broke my ribs." The words tasted like ash, but speaking them aloud felt like breaking a chain. Laura pulled me inside, settled me at her kitchen table, and made tea with trembling hands. For the first time in hours, I felt something close to safe. I told her everything haltingly at first, then pouring it out the folder at dinner, the threats, the blows, Margaret's smile. I showed her the phone, the recording glowing red on the screen. She listened without interrupting, her knuckles white around her mug. When I finished, she leaned forward, eyes fierce. "Clara, we're going to the police." "Not yet," I whispered, surprising even myself. "They'll spin it. They always do. I want to make sure they can't twist it this time." I explained about the doctor's report, the x-rays, the recording, the bank accounts I had already suspected. Laura sat back, exhaling slowly. "Then you're going to take this to court. And you're going to win." Her certainty struck through my doubt like lightning, illuminating a path I hadn't dared to imagine. That night, I stayed at Laura's apartment, curled on her couch, the phone tucked under my pillow like a weapon, my ribs throbbing with every shallow breath. Sleep was fractured, restless, but beneath the pain was a new pulse. Not just survival. Purpose. I was no longer just the girl who absorbed their blows in silence. I was the woman who had proof, and I would use it. Morning light filtered through Laura's kitchen blinds, painting the room in stripes of pale gold. I sat at her table, hunched over my laptop, the steam from untouched coffee curling upward while every breath reminded me of cracked bones beneath my skin. My ribs ached, but the ache was no longer just pain, it was fuel. Laura leaned over my shoulder, her hair falling into her face as she whispered, "Start from the beginning, every detail, every paper. We don't leave anything out." I opened the folder of bank statements I had copied weeks ago before Daniel changed the passwords. At first glance, they looked routine, but line by line, the pattern emerged, withdrawals timed with his trips to the city, thousands disappearing from the maintenance fund Grandpa had set aside. I highlighted them one by one, my pulse quickening. He hadn't just threatened me with violence. He'd been bleeding the accounts dry behind my back. Laura grabbed a notepad, jotting down dates and amounts. "This alone shows fraud," she murmured. Then she looked at me, eyes sharp. "But it's not enough. We need to bury them in proof." I nodded, reaching for another stack of papers, utility bills, property tax receipts. That's when I noticed something strange. A payment made for a property I didn't recognize. A vacation house. Purchased months earlier, taxes covered from our shared account. My chest tightened, rage sparking. He was already living off what wasn't his. I scanned the documents to my cloud drive, labeling each file with meticulous detail. Then I pulled out the phone, my thumb hovering over the recording. Laura pressed her hand to mine. "Play it." The audio filled the kitchen, Daniel's voice dripping with arrogance. Richard's gruff mutters, Margaret's chilling laugh. The words cracked the air like whips. "You'll be nothing. You're too dramatic. You'll wish you had signed." We sat in silence as the evidence of my nightmare unfolded in cold, digital permanence. Laura shivered when Margaret's laughter played back low and satisfied. "God," she whispered, "it's all there." They damned themselves. For a moment, I closed my eyes, hearing Grandpa's voice echo against the threats. "Don't ever let anyone tell you it isn't yours, too." That memory steadied me, made the phone feel heavier in my hand, not a burden but a weapon. That afternoon, Laura made a call to a contact of hers, a lawyer named Evelyn Cole. Within hours, we were sitting in a modest office lined with law books, the hum of the city muffled outside. Evelyn was in her 50s, sharp-eyed, her presence calm but commanding. She listened without interruption as I laid out the events, sliding my phone across the desk to play the recording. Halfway through Daniel's voice, she raised a hand and stopped it. "That's enough," she said. "You don't realize how strong this is. We're not only looking at assault, we're looking at financial abuse fraud conspiracy. And if the judge hears your mother laughing while you were on the floor, that's complicity." Her words landed like strikes of a hammer, forging the shape of something solid. A case. Evelyn outlined the steps with crisp efficiency. First, file a police report with the medical documents and recording. Second, move for a protective order. Third, freeze the assets before your brother drains them further. "We hit hard and fast," she said, "or they'll spin this into another story where you're the problem." I nodded, the tremor in my hands stilled by her certainty. For years, my parents had called me dramatic, too sensitive, too young. But Evelyn looked at me as if I was credible, powerful, already halfway to victory. That shift lit something inside me no blow could extinguish. When we left her office, Laura squeezed my arm gently. "You're not alone anymore." And she was right. For the first time, I wasn't carrying the weight in silence. I had allies. I had evidence. I had a plan. That night back at Laura's, I spread the documents across her table, arranging them into neat piles: financials, medical records, audio transcripts. Each stack felt like bricks building a fortress against their lies. My ribs still burned, but beneath the pain was resolve. The gaslighting had ended. The era of proof had begun. The next morning, I stood outside the police station, the autumn wind tugging at my coat, each gust stabbing my ribs with reminders of the night before. Laura walked beside me, steady, her presence the anchor I needed. The recording weighed heavy in my pocket, the folder of medical reports and bank statements clutched in my hand. For years, I had walked into rooms with nothing but words, and words alone had always been twisted against me. Today, I carried proof. Inside the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly the scent of stale coffee lingering. At the front desk, the sergeant raised his eyebrows when I explained why I was there. "You have a recording?" he asked, tone skeptical at first. I nodded, sliding the phone and documents across the counter. Within minutes, I was seated in a small office with Detective Reynolds, a man with graying hair and eyes that scanned like searchlights. He listened as I recounted the attack, then pressed play on the audio. The room changed. Daniel's voice filled the air, venomous and certain. "You'll be nothing. You'll wish you had signed." Richard's grunt followed the dull thud of his boot connecting with my ribs, and then Margaret's soft, chilling laugh. Reynolds' expression shifted from detached to deliberate, his pen stilling on the page. When the clip ended, silence hung heavy. Finally, he said, "Clara, are you willing to testify to all of this in court?" My voice came out steady, surprising even me. "Yes." He leaned back, jaw tight. "Then we move forward. We'll file assault charges immediately, and your lawyer can pursue the financial side." He gathered the papers with a care that felt ceremonial, as though each sheet was a weapon now cataloged for battle. By that afternoon, Evelyn had filed for an emergency protective order. She guided me through the courthouse's echoing halls, the marble floors, amplifying each step until it felt like the whole building was listening. We sat before a judge in a cramped chamber, the walls lined with shelves of dusty case law. Evelyn presented the medical records first, her voice calm but edged with steel. 2 fractured ribs contusions consistent with blunt force trauma. Then she handed over the police report and played the recording. The judge's face, stern and weathered, tightened at Richard's kick at Margaret's laugh. His gavel rapped once, sharp as a gunshot. Protective order granted, effective immediately. He will have no contact with you, Miss Mitchell. Relief surged, but Evelyn wasn't done. Your Honor, she said, we are also preparing a motion to freeze all estate accounts pending investigation. The judge nodded slowly. File it and I'll review within the week. Outside, the cool air hit me like baptism. For the first time in years, I felt a wall between myself and them. A legal wall they couldn't gaslight away. Daniel could no longer storm into my apartment. Richard could no longer loom with fists. Margaret could no longer call with false sweetness. But word traveled fast. That evening, Margaret's number flashed on my phone unanswered. A voicemail followed her voice, sharp stripped of gentleness. Clara, what have you done? This is family business and you've turned it into a circus. If you think outsiders will protect you, you're mistaken. Blood is blood. The message ended with a click like a slammed door. I deleted it hands steady. Laura watched me, her expression taut. They know they've lost control, she said. That makes them dangerous, but it also means we're hitting where it hurts. She was right. For the first time, they were reacting to me, not the other way around. That night, I lay awake on Laura's couch, bruises aching binder tight around my chest. But my mind was clearer than it had been in years. Tomorrow would bring more hearings, more battles, more attempts by them to twist the truth. But tonight, I had something I had never had before the law on my side and evidence they couldn't erase. And as I drifted into shallow sleep, one thought pulsed steady beneath the pain. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was war, and for once it would be fought on my terms. The courthouse loomed gray and solemn against the morning sky, its stone pillars casting long shadows across the steps crowded with reporters and curious onlookers. My ribs still throbbed with each breath, but the brace beneath my blouse reminded me of the truth. Pain was no longer just pain, it was evidence. Laura walked beside me, steadying my pace, while Evelyn strode ahead with the confidence of someone who had carried dozens of battles into rooms like this. As we entered, the air cooled thick with the hum of voices and the faint metallic scent of old vents. Daniel was already there, seated at the defendant's table, in a sharp suit that couldn't disguise the tension in his jaw. Margaret sat beside him, pearls around her neck, posture stiff with forced dignity. Richard stood just behind them, his bulk looming, his expression carved into stone. They looked like a united front, but to me, they looked like a crumbling wall, pretending it wasn't full of cracks. When the bailiff called the room to order, silence fell. The judge, the same one who had granted the protective order, adjusted his glasses and nodded toward Evelyn. Proceed. Evelyn rose, her presence commanding without theatrics. She began with the medical report, laying the x-rays on the evidence screen. 2 fractured ribs consistent with blunt force trauma. She spoke clinically, her voice steady, unshaken, while my insides twisted as the images glowed on the monitor. The judge's gaze flicked from the x-rays to me, his lips tightening. Then Evelyn pressed play on the recording. Daniel's voice filled the chamber venomous and cold. You'll be nothing. You'll wish you had signed. Richard's grunt followed, then the sickening thud of his boot. The sound of my gasp echoed faint but unmistakable. And then Margaret's laugh, soft, chilling the sound of a mother's cruelty carved into eternity. The silence after was suffocating. I felt dozens of eyes on me, but I kept my gaze forward, my breathing shallow. The judge's expression hardened, his knuckles whitening around the gavel. This is not family tension, he said flatly. This is abuse. Evelyn continued sliding bank statements into the record. Withdrawals traced to Daniel's trips payments for a vacation property made from estate accounts. She spoke with precision, stitching together a pattern so tight no lie could slip through. This was not oversight, she told the court. This was calculated financial abuse. When it was my turn, I rose slowly, every movement reminding me of the pain etched into my bones. The oath felt heavy as I swore to tell the truth. My voice trembled at first, but steadied as I described that night, the folder on the table, the threats, the shove that cracked my ribs, the kick that stole my breath, my mother's smile as I lay on the floor. I didn't embellish. I didn't need to. The truth was raw enough. Daniel's lawyer tried to cross-examine, painting it as a family dispute gone too far. He asked if I had provoked Daniel, if my memory might be exaggerated under stress. Evelyn objected sharply and the judge sustained, but the lawyer pressed on, suggesting the recording was taken out of context. That was when Evelyn leaned forward, eyes sharp. "Out of context," she said. "Let's listen again." She replayed the clip, and the courtroom filled once more with the thud of my father's kick and my mother's chilling laugh. The room seemed to freeze around those sounds, undeniable, unforgivable. When Daniel himself took the stand, his calm facade began to fracture. He claimed he had only restrained me, that I had stumbled into the table by accident. But when the prosecutor asked if restraining someone included threatening to erase them from the family, his silence was damning. His jaw worked, but no words came. Margaret squeezed his hand, her own face pale. Richard muttered under his breath loud enough that the bailiff had to step closer. The judge's patience was thinning, his gavel rapping once to restore order. The prosecution presented the financials: next bank transfers, shell accounts, property deeds. An investigator testified, connecting every suspicious withdrawal to Daniel's personal expenditures. The jurors shifted in their seats, expressions tightening. The weight of the evidence was too much to ignore. Finally, closing arguments. Evelyn rose, her voice measured, deliberate. "You have heard his voice. You have seen the medical records. You have watched her walk into this courtroom with the injuries he gave her. This is not a misunderstanding. This is a pattern of control, of violence, of theft. The choice before you is not about family drama. It is about justice." When the jury left to deliberate, my heart pounded so loud it drowned the whispers around me. I sat, rigid hands clasped, every nerve stretched taut. Margaret avoided my gaze. Her lips pressed so thin they were nearly invisible. Richard sat with arms crossed, a mountain of stubbornness, but his foot tapped restlessly against the floor. Daniel stared straight ahead, but I saw the tightness around his eyes, the first cracks in his certainty. It took less than an hour. The jury filed back in, faces grave. The foreman rose, holding the slip of paper like a blade. Guilty on the charge of assault. Guilty on financial misconduct. The words rang through the chamber like a bell tolling the end of an era. The judge nodded, his tone unyielding, as he delivered sentencing. 18 months imprisonment for the assault. Restitution for the siphoned funds. All estate assets frozen pending review under court supervision. Richard was ordered to probation, barred from contact with me. Margaret's role, the judge noted coldly, was complicit. Her credibility as a manager of any estate funds was revoked permanently. As the bailiff moved to handcuff Daniel, I watched the fury contort his face. His eyes locked on mine, blazing with the kind of hatred that once would have made me cower. But not now. Now it only confirmed what I already knew. I had stripped away his power, leaving him exposed. Margaret whispered something to him, desperate, but the clink of cuffs silenced them both. When the gavel struck for the last time, I felt the vibration in my bones. Not as pain this time, but as release. The courtroom buzzed with voices, reporters scribbling, whispers rippling. But all I could hear was my own steady breath. For years they had told me I was too dramatic, too young, too weak. Today, the court had spoken differently. Today, I was believed. As Daniel was led away, head bowed, Margaret refused to look at me. Richard's glare was a wall, but even walls crumble. I stood taller, my bruised ribs aching with every inhale, but my voice clear in the silence I carried within. This was not the end of the fight, but it was the first true victory. The judgment was more than a ruling. It was a demolition of the fortress they had built around themselves for decades. When the judge's words echoed through the chamber, I could see the ripples hit each of them differently. Daniel paling as though someone had drained the arrogance straight from his veins, Richard stiffening with a fury that found no outlet, and Margaret shrinking in her chair, lips trembling despite the pearls around her neck. The bailiff snapped the cuffs around Daniel's wrists, the metallic click loud enough to silence even the whispers of the reporters. He jerked once, testing the hold, but the officer on his left shoved him forward with practiced force. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes. Not fear of me, not even fear of the truth, but fear of consequences. Richard's face flushed, red veins rising at his temple. He muttered, "This is a farce," under his breath, loud enough that the bailiff's eyes flicked toward him. The judge didn't miss it. "Mr. Mitchell, one more word, and I will hold you in contempt." The authority in his tone clipped Richard's defiance short, leaving him glaring at the floor like a boy scolded at school. For a man who had built his life on looming, the humiliation of being silenced publicly struck deeper than any fine could. And Margaret, her collapse was quieter but sharper. As the judge read the line revoking her rights to oversee estate matters, her shoulders curled inward, her grip tightening on her purse. For decades, she had clung to the illusion of refinement, the matriarch who smoothed over cracks with smiles. But that day, the cracks became chasms and her complicity was inked into public record. The whispers from the benches behind us weren't about my bruises anymore. They were about her laugh on the tape, the laugh of a mother watching her daughter be broken. That stain would never wash out. The reporters swarmed to the hallway as the session ended. Flashes burst like lightning, questions hurled into the air. "Clara, how do you feel, Clara? Do you think justice was done?" I didn't answer. Not yet. I walked through them slowly, every step deliberate, every inhale still painful but steady. Because the real answer wasn't for cameras. It was for me. Justice wasn't just the gavel strike. It was Daniel in handcuffs, Margaret stripped of power, Richard silenced by law. It was the reversal of every lie they had fed me. For once, their actions had led not to my shame, but to their downfall. That night back at Laura's, we sat at her kitchen table again, the same spot where days earlier I had first played the recording. Only now the table was clear. The folders closed the evidence no longer just my burden, but the foundation of their undoing. Laura poured tea, her hands finally steady. "You did it," she said softly. "For years they told you your pain wasn't real. Today the world heard it." I nodded, my ribs aching as I leaned back, but this time the ache didn't weigh me down. It reminded me I had survived, that I had fought, and that I had won something bigger than property or money. I had won my voice. For them, the consequences had only begun. Daniel would serve his sentence behind walls he couldn't charm his way through. His name, once tied to ambition, would now be linked with violence and fraud, whispered in shame across town. Richard's reputation, once built on strength, had collapsed into public disgust. Margaret's carefully polished image was tarnished beyond repair, her name forever marked by her laugh at her daughter's suffering. For me, though, the judgment was more than punishment for them. It was a door opening. A door I had been pounding on my entire life, finally unlocked by the weight of truth. And as I looked out the window into the night, I realized something vital. The fight wasn't just about inheritance anymore. It was about reclaiming the parts of myself they had tried to erase. And now that I had taken them back, there was nothing they could do to silence me again. The days after the verdict felt strangely quiet, like the world itself was holding its breath. My ribs still ached when I moved too fast, and each morning I woke with the phantom memory of Daniel's shoulder slamming into me, Richard's boot crushing air from my lungs, Margaret's laughter ringing in my ears. But when I turned on the radio or opened the local paper, the headlines reminded me that the silence was deceptive. The whole town was talking. "Inheritance dispute leads to assault conviction," the front page read. "Local family torn apart by violence and fraud." I hadn't asked for publicity, but it had arrived uninvited, spilling through grocery store aisles and whispered in church pews. Neighbors who once glanced past me with indifference now approached cautiously, some with sympathy, others with guilt etched into their faces. I had suspected something one woman admitted softly by the produce stand. "I wish I had said something sooner." I smiled politely, but inside the words were jagged. Where were you when I needed someone to believe me? For Daniel, the fallout was immediate. His business associates cut ties, contracts evaporated. The image of him in handcuffs, jaw tight with fury, was plastered across the evening news. For a man who had lived his life as the golden boy, being reduced to convicted abuser was a cage far worse than prison walls. I heard whispers through the grapevine that even in jail he couldn't escape recognition. Guards muttered his name. Inmates sneered, "You're the guy who broke your sister's ribs for money." And I pictured him there, stripped of power, stripped of control, left only with the reality of who he was. Richard's downfall was quieter but sharper. His friends from the VFW hall stopped calling. The men who once admired his rough authority avoided him, ashamed to be linked to someone who kicked his own daughter while she lay gasping. The silence around him grew heavier than the judge's probation order. For a man who thrived on respect, the loss of it was a slow, grinding punishment. Margaret's collapse was social. For decades, she had been the polished matriarch hosting dinners, presiding over holidays, her smile the mask that hid every bruise she ignored. Now, her name carried the stain of that laugh captured on tape. The women she once gossiped with at church avoided her pew, shifting uncomfortably when she entered the room. Cousins who had once flocked to her holiday table stopped visiting, unwilling to be associated with her cruelty. I knew from neighbors that she now dined alone, her carefully laid table set for one. She still left me voicemails, her voice trembling between anger and desperation. "Clara, you've destroyed us. Clara, you don't understand what family means." I deleted them all. My boundaries were steel now, and she no longer had the power to pierce them. For me, the aftermath was both liberation and exhaustion. I moved out of Laura's apartment into a small place of my own, a modest 2-bedroom with light streaming through wide windows, the kind of light I had once been too afraid to let in. I furnished it slowly, piece by piece, each choice mine alone. A bookshelf in the corner filled with novels I loved, a soft rug that muffled my steps, curtains in a shade of blue that made the mornings feel calm. Simple things, but each one a declaration. This space was mine, untouched by their shadows. I also began therapy, a decision Evelyn had urged. The sessions were difficult, peeling back layers of gaslighting and abuse I had carried since childhood. At first, even saying the words out loud felt like betrayal. Betrayal of the family's narrative I had been forced to recite for so long. But over time, I began to see that speaking was not betrayal. Silence had been. Each confession was a brick removed from the wall they had built inside me, letting in more air, more light. But freedom carried triggers too. Loud noises still made my ribs ache, a phantom pain echoing the crack of that night. Certain phrases, "Don't be dramatic," "Stop exaggerating," still made my chest tighten. Yet therapy taught me to breathe through them, to remind myself I was safe now. Their words no longer defined me. Their power was gone. I began to draw boundaries as firmly in my personal life as the court had done legally. Calls from distant relatives went unanswered. Letters from Margaret remained unopened, stacked neatly in a drawer I refused to touch. When I walked past the courthouse weeks later, I paused at the steps, remembering the moment the recording played aloud. That was the day I stopped being erased. That was the day I stepped into the light. The social fallout wasn't mine to carry, it was theirs. Mine was a different path now, healing, rebuilding, and for the first time choosing who I wanted in my life rather than being forced into roles defined by blood and silence. Nearly a year has passed since the gavel came down, and still there are mornings when I wake up clutching my ribs, half expecting to hear Daniel's voice or feel Richard's shadow filling the doorway. Trauma doesn't vanish with a verdict. It lingers, whispering at the edges of peace. But when I sit at my kitchen table now, sunlight pouring through open curtains, the warmth across my face reminds me I survived, I fought, and I am no longer theirs to break. My life has reshaped itself into something quiet but strong. I enrolled in graduate school, a program I once thought out of reach because Margaret told me it was impractical. Now I walk across campus with books under my arm, my steps steady, my head high. My professors know me not as the black sheep of the Mitchell family, but as Clara, the woman who asks sharp questions and refuses to be silenced. That alone feels like a victory my parents will never comprehend. Financially, the restitution gave me more than stability. It gave me agency. I hired advisors who respected my intelligence instead of condescending to me. Together, we built a plan that turned stolen inheritance into a foundation for independence. Each deposit into my account felt like another chain snapping, another piece of control slipping away from them forever. But the deeper healing didn't come from money. It came from speaking. I began volunteering at a local shelter for survivors of domestic and financial abuse. At first, I just served coffee and listened, unsure if my story would help or only reopen wounds. But one evening, a young woman sat across from me, her hands trembling as she whispered, "My family says I'm too dramatic, that I imagine things." The words cut straight through me, so familiar they might have been carved from my own past. I told her gently, "You are not dramatic. You are not imagining." And I shared a piece of my story. Her eyes widened, and for the first time I saw recognition. Not pity, not dismissal, but recognition. That was when I realized my pain had purpose beyond survival. Months later, I stood on a stage at a legal advocacy conference facing rows of attorneys, social workers, survivors, and allies. My ribs no longer ached with every breath, but the memory of that crack, that laugh, that betrayal lived inside me like a scar. I told them everything the night Daniel broke my ribs, Richard's kick, Margaret's smile, the recording I had tucked under the couch, the way evidence became my salvation. I told them how silence had been my prison and voice had been my key. Some nodded, some wiped their eyes, some scribbled notes, as if my story were more than one person's pain, but a map to prevent others from being erased. Walking off that stage into the crisp evening air, I felt lighter than I had in years. My story had grown bigger than me. It had become a weapon for justice, a lifeline for those still trapped in shadows. As for Daniel, prison stripped him of everything he once wielded. The golden boy reputation dissolved into nothing but whispers of shame. Even when his sentence ends, he will walk into a world that remembers not his charm, but his cruelty. Richard, once respected, now sits in silence at the bar, where no one saves him a seat. Margaret's letters still arrive, sometimes begging for forgiveness, sometimes spitting blame, but they remain unopened, sealed in a drawer that will one day be burned. Their consequences were not just legal. They were social, permanent, etched into the town's memory. And me, I have stopped chasing apologies. They would never be enough, and they were never coming. Forgiveness is not my duty. My duty is to live free, to keep my boundaries firm, to remind myself every day that I am more than their cruelty. Sometimes neighbors still ask if it was worth it, worth the trial, the public scrutiny, the endless reliving of violence. My answer is always the same. When you have lived under someone else's thumb, the first breath of freedom is worth every battle it takes to get there. Now when I walk past the courthouse, I don't flinch. I pause at the steps and let the memory of that recording being played echo in my mind, not as a wound, but as proof. Proof that truth once spoken cannot be silenced. Proof that even the most toxic family cannot erase the one who refuses to disappear. This story is no longer just mine. It belongs to anyone who has been told they are too dramatic, too sensitive, too young. To anyone who has been gaslit into silence. To anyone who has been kicked while they were already on the floor. My message to them is simple. You are not imagining it, and you are not alone. Speak, even if your voice shakes. Record, even if your hand trembles. Fight, even if your ribs ache. Because justice may not come overnight, but it comes. And when it does, it is sharper than any blow, louder than any laugh meant to diminish you. As I lock my apartment door at night, I feel the weight of safety in a way I never used to. My space is mine. My voice is mine. My life is mine. And no one, not a brother, not a father, not even a mother, can take that from me again. The moral is not forgiveness. It is not family above all. The moral is boundaries. The moral is justice. The moral is freedom. And as I stand here now, healed and whole, I know this. Every scar, every broken bone, every sleepless night became the foundation of the life I am building, one defined not by their control, but by my choice.